We all know France and Britain, their definition of rivals. Fighting against each other for centuries, both grew to massive sizes and became some of the greatest powers on Earth. But their conflicts first started after the rise of the Normans in England, later giving rise to the Angevin dynasty. This dynasty led England to become one of the strongest nations in Europe during their reign, referred to by historians as the Angevin Empire. However, most of this massive kingdom crumbled only a few years into the reign of John Lackland, mostly due to his poor, well, everything. But what if this changed? What if instead of collapsing, the Angevin Empire survived to conquer France? Well, I'm here to answer that question. First off, how does this even happen? It mostly boils down to fixing John's horrible reign. But first, some minor tweaks to the timeline to help our Angevin Empire out. Our first change comes during the reign of Richard I, otherwise known as Richard the Lionheart. On his way back from the Third Crusade, he was captured by Leopold of Austria and was ransomed back to England for the equivalent of 2 years' worth of taxes. This event was crippling to the coffers of England, and caused for the future John's reign to be plagued with monetary issues. So we can have this event just not happen. The most major change is made after John takes the throne. Put simply, he needs to not be horrible. Due to the true failure of John's reign in our timeline, it would take a serious change in his personality and ability, making this the more unrealistic route to an English conquest of France, but it's the least complicated to set up. John will crucially do 2 specific things differently. 1, he will treat his vassals better, and 2, he will not disagree with the Pope on the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, preventing him from being excommunicated. Both of these give John's vassals a much better opinion of him, and would lead to far fewer costly revolts. The increased support of his vassals and higher amounts of money gives him a much better chance at preventing the French incursion into England's northern French territory. In this alternate war, the French will still try to sweep through the north of the country, but are beaten in a battle and are forced to retreat. Given the pre-existing English plan, John would likely subdue the mostly independent Duchy of Toulouse before marching on France proper. This war would definitely not lead to an annexation of France, only having minor territory changes in the north. The real prize is the conquest of Toulouse, securing the southern border and dramatically increasing the power of England. England is now in an amazing position to conquer the rest of France in a relatively short time frame compared to our timeline. However, here we hit a snag. There are no sources on what the Angevin king's goals after conquering France were, and so the rest of this kingdom's expansions on the map are just guesses. Likely, they would expand to the detriment of the HRE, like France in our timeline. Of course, the English conquest of the British Isles would commence slightly differently in this timeline. Wales would likely be conquered much sooner due to the increased power of the Marches and the increased stability from the lack of Barons' Wars. For similar reasons, Ireland would be dominated sooner. Scotland would also likely fall much sooner without support from France and the increased funds of England in this timeline. But as we hit the mid-16th century, the eyes of the new Franco-Britannic could shift to the west much earlier than in our timeline. The reason being, due to now bordering Spain, the British would be rivals with the Spanish much earlier on. Seeing the riches of the Americas, the British of this timeline might try to invest in colonies much earlier, not only trying to gain the valuable resources of the New World for themselves, but also trying to rob Spain of these same resources. If the Brits start colonizing around the 1550s, they would likely focus on valuable territories around the Caribbean and Mexico, rather than in the north like in our timeline. The 2 behemoth nations would begin a race for colonization. After conquering all of Central America, they would race north in search of new resources. This is a map of what I guess the Americas could look like after its full colonization. Notably, I have shown that the North is dominated by much more unknown faces than in our timeline: Denmark, Sweden, Russia, and the Dutch. Of course, all of these nations initially participated in colonization during our own timeline, but were out-colonized and conquered by the French and British. In this timeline, they could have a time to shine in America. I consider the least likely colonial power of this timeline to be the Dutch. No offense to possible history, but the Dutch in this timeline are in a very precarious position as it is, with the British being able to easily cut off their access to the Americas and have a very easy land route to invade the Dutch homeland, leaving a very real possibility that the Dutch colonial effort would be ceded to the British, just like in our timeline. From this point on, I cannot predict any more map changes, as the timeline has deviated so much from our timeline. But I can give some more information about the internal Franco-Britannic Empire. The capital of this kingdom would most certainly be in Paris, as it is both a better administrative hub and is closer to the more rowdy French nobles. Additionally, the nobles and royals of this kingdom would likely also speak French as opposed to English. Although I see the British Isles adopting French altogether unlikely, the English language would be drastically different, with even more loaned words from French and with a longer mingling with the French language through the nobles and high class. English would be even more French-derived than our timeline. Likely it would come to a point where English and French are almost mutually intelligible. French would probably also adopt some English traits and words, likely words referring to the lower class. The kingdom would overall look less like an English conquest of France, and more like a French conquest of England. That's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed the first video of my channel. Make sure to like and subscribe. Stay crazy.